Who's having a good time? Now, I want to hear a little bit more than that. Who's having a good time? Okay. My name's Floyd Brown, and I look forward to Freedom Fest every year, and we've got one of the greatest sessions coming up. And it's going to be a fascinating session. In fact, it's so fascinating that when they told me I was going to be introducing it, I couldn't really wrap my brain around it. Because if you look at the actual schedule, it says Christopher Hitchens is going to be here, okay? But according to the New York Times, Christopher Hitchens is dead. Not only is he dead, he's a dead atheist. And a dead atheist is really dead. So I have to admit, I'm a Christian, and I'm such an old-fashioned Christian that I actually believe in heaven and hell. So where is Christopher Hitchens? I'll leave that to you to decide. But our speaker this afternoon is Dinesh D'Souza. And I'm supposed to introduce him, even though all of you know who he is. He's one of the most famous authors in America. He's produced, I don't know how many bestsellers from, all kinds of different bestsellers. He's a movie maker. How many of you have gone and seen a Dinesh D'Souza movie? Okay. 2016, or my favorite, America, Imagine the World Without Her. Now, most of you think of Dinesh as somebody who just focuses on politics, but he has a lot of really interesting ideas in the realm of theology and apologetics. His first book in that area was What's So Great About Christianity? And I remember when it came out a few years ago, it really sent shockwaves across America. He's done books about suffering. He was actually also president of King's College in New York. So it's an area that he has studied very, very completely. And not only that, he's going to answer your questions today. So let's welcome Dinesh D'Souza to talk to us about his arguments with atheists. Let's welcome Dinesh.
Thanks, Lloyd. Floyd, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to be here. I always love Freedom Fest. I've become kind of a regular here. And in the past, as some of you know, I've been usually imported to do debates at Freedom Fest. And I think when Mark Skousen invited me to do this particular topic, he envisioned some sort of a debate, either with Michael Shermer, or Mark had this crazy idea of recalling the ghost of Christopher Hitchens. You know, Hitchens and I go way back. We did our first debate about capitalism versus socialism. And unfortunately for Hitchens, this debate was in 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall fell. We had a debate at Georgetown University. Then I moved to California, and Hitchens went on to do his thing. And then many years later, I turned on the television, and there was Christopher, and he was debating a pastor, as I recall, from Birmingham, Alabama, and totally ridiculing the guy. And they were arguing about Christianity, and they were arguing about various theological topics. And I watched it, and I thought to myself, this is really not a debate, because it's two ships passing in the night. The pastor went to divinity school. He's a student of the Bible. He's making arguments and claims based on a book that is, by its own assertion, a book of revelation. The Bible is not a book of argument. It makes no arguments. The Bible is a book of claims. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The Bible doesn't try to prove that. It states it. And it states it on the basis of divine authority. So here's a pastor speaking, you might say, one kind of language, the language of revelation. And here's Hitchens employing a different kind of language. Now, Hitchens would say, I'm employing the language of reason. But in fact, Hitchens is employing, you could call it the skepticism of the Oxford style of debate, in which he was very well trained. Hitchens was using his trademark sarcasm and barbs and insults and so on, in my view, clearly winning the debate. But winning the debate not by engaging the other side, but in a sense trumping it. Using reason, you might say, to trump revelation. Now, it's actually worth stepping back for a moment and recalling that these twin pillars of reason and revelation are actually the foundation stones of Western civilization. If we look at the roots of the West are in Athens and Jerusalem. If you look at the American founders, they didn't come to America empty-handed. They brought with them the ideas of Athens and Jerusalem, and the American experiment actually combines both. By Athens, of course, we mean the tradition of Greece and pre-Christian Rome. By Jerusalem, we mean, of course, Judaism and Christianity. Let's remember that our Western civilization is built on both. So while the relationship between those two is never comfortable, why? Because they actually have different sources of ultimate authority. Nevertheless, it seems to me hard to imagine the West without one or the other pillar. Jerusalem without Athens would make for a very different culture, something probably more resembling Orthodox Jews in Israel, for example. Similarly, Athens without Jerusalem would be a very different society. I mean, let's just, today when we think of ancient Greece and Rome, we see it through the prism of 2,000 years of Christianity. So we actually don't see Greece and Rome as they actually were. We see them as they've been sanitized by Christianity. If we actually remove Christianity and went back into ancient Athens, we would find that world an incomprehensible place. Incomprehensible in its almost pathological hostility to trade. The merchant was absolutely reviled in ancient society. Pathological in its appetite for blood. Those civilizations were completely stained with blood, not just the blood of empire, not just the blood of slavery, but blood for entertainment. Bloody spectacles were hugely gratifying to people in a manner that we today would have very great difficulty understanding. And finally, to be kind of blunt about it, pederasty or pedophilia, sex with children or sex with young boys, something that today would be considered a practice that would be unacceptable in the extreme, was actually a routine part of ancient society and was in fact embedded in a philosophy of education in which, in a sense, the older man and the young boy had sort of something to give to each other. So all of this, if we were to bring it right back, would be bizarre in the extreme. Coming back to my story with Hitchens, here you have Hitchens and the pastor, and I thought to myself, this is not a fair fight. Wouldn't it be interesting to actually have a real debate on very important issues about God and life after death that is conducted entirely on Hitchens' ground? So what if we were to set aside the Bible, do not discuss arguments based on revelation, but look at arguments based on reason alone, and ask, in that case, does reason point in favor of Christianity or against it? In favor of life after death or against it? I've been asked to focus on life after death, I think, because Mark has been reading my book on this topic. I want to say a few words that embed the life after death argument in a little bigger context. And then I really want to open the floor to discussion because, as I say, this was envisioned to be a kind of debate, and I sort of feel I don't want to become any kind of a preacher here tonight. I actually, what I want to do is take some of the famous arguments against life after death and show how unreasonable they actually are. unreasonable they actually are. In fact, in my very first debate with Hitchens, this topic came up directly. And Hitchens made the argument that life after death, I pointed out that life after death is a virtually universal belief and aspiration. In virtually all cultures going back to the very dawn of mankind, there has been this insistence that there is another life that follows this life. And I said that if this belief were irrational, why do people have it? Why does it arise? In other words, we can understand why every culture believes in rocks and trees, because we can see rocks, we can see trees. But why would people have this belief that there is another life when they have no way, in a sense, to experimentally confirm that belief? Where would such a belief come from? And Hitchens goes, well, I know where it would come from. It would come from the idea that, and here Hitchens was drawing on Sigmund Freud, wish fulfillment. In other words, we have to face the grim reality of death and annihilation, but we all wish that there's going to be a better life, and therefore this wishful thinking drives the opinion of major religions in universally affirming this concept of life after death. Wishful thinking. We all would love to live in a world in which there was no death and no suffering, no diabetes, bodies lasted forever. And that's the explanation. The human tendency to project one's wishes into some fictional future reality. So I said to Hitchens, I said, Christopher, well, if you take the traditional religions, let's just focus on the Western religions, Judaism and Christianity, let's test your argument that the belief in life after death is the product of wish fulfillment. Your argument appears to explain one half of the belief in life after death, namely the belief in heaven. Why? Because in heaven, according to Jewish and Christian doctrine, there is indeed no suffering and no death and no diabetes. However, Jews and Christians also happen to believe in another place that is called hell. And hell is a little worse than diabetes. And it's a little worse than suffering, and it's a little worse even than annihilation. In fact, it implies some sort of eternal separation, damnation, hellfire and flames, if you will. So my question to Hitchens is, why would a wish fulfillment species invent that? Why come up with something that is worse than life? Who would want that? Where would anyone get that idea? And he came up to me after the debate and he confessed. He said, I have to think again, because he said, actually, the Freudian explanation doesn't quite work. Not that it's flat out wrong, but he says, I concede that it does nothing. It does no work in explaining what is clearly a central aspect of so-called afterlife doctrine. Michael Shermer and I debated life after death on a college campus. Now, this was some years ago. And I'm going to try to do full justice to Shermer's argument. If he's here, he can run up to the stage and challenge me. But we were discussing life after death, and he basically, Shermer and I are friends, and he goes, Dinesh, he goes, you are a partially rational person. He goes, because, he goes, for most of your life, in most of the things you do, you're a pretty rational guy. He goes, but when it comes to your religious beliefs, reason appears to go out the window. And I said, well, why do you say that? He goes, well, look, first of all, if somebody told you that that your wallet had been stolen, you would reach right back into your pocket and check. You would use verification as a way of trying to figure out if your wallet was still there or not. But he goes, but on the other hand, you have all kinds of beliefs, like this nonsense that there's another life waiting for you. You have no evidence for it. You have no way to know if that's true, and yet you believe it. So there you go. These are beliefs that are totally uncorroborated by reason and are therefore irrational. And I said to Shermer, do you believe in life after death? And he goes, no. And I said, well, What is the evidence for that position? In other words, what Shermer was basically saying is, I have no way of knowing if there's life after death because death is, as Shakespeare put it, the undiscovered country, right? No one has, in a sense, been there and come back to tell us what's going on. And since death is the undiscovered country, since we haven't been to the other side of the curtain, there seems to be no basis for asserting that there's life after death. But by the same logic, there is no basis for asserting that there isn't. In other words, has Shermer been to the other side of the curtain? Has he interviewed any dead guys? No. So in other words, what is the evidence for his assertion that there's nothing on that side? How does he know that? The point I'm trying to make is not that Shermer knows and I don't, or I know and he doesn't. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Neither of us actually knows. I don't know and he doesn't either. So then what's the real difference between us? The real difference between us is that I, as a believer, by the way, it's worth clarifying that a believer is not a knower. Belief and knowledge are not the same thing. I believe that there is a place called Papua New Guinea, although I've never been there. But I wouldn't say I believe I have a brother because I know the guy. So when you have direct experience, you know. When you don't, you believe. In that sense, believers are to some degree agnostics. And they're agnostics because they don't know. They believe even though they don't know. The point I wanted to make with Shermer was that the real difference between him and me is simply this. As a believer, I'm acknowledging that my position on life after death is based on faith. He is also taking a faith-based position. He doesn't know either. However, he's insisting dogmatically that a position that he holds based on faith is actually based on evidence. In other words, he's insisting that a position that he holds based on unreason is actually based on reason. The real difference is that he is deluded and I'm not as to the true basis of why we believe what we do. That's the real difference. Now, let's think for a minute about life after death. Remember that in most non-Western religions, life after death is believed to be an empirical fact that has nothing to do with God. The Hindus, for example, have the belief in reincarnation. The belief that your present life is a reflection of your actions in past lives, and that your present life is going to be refracted into future lives, reflecting what you did in this life. Now, the Hindus don't believe that this is because of some supernatural intervention. They believe that this is the way the world is. In other words, it is an empirical fact, no different from any other fact, that when we die, our fate determines what we're going to be. Either they're right or they're wrong, but it's important to realize they are actually making a factual claim. They're actually making a factual claim that, unfortunately, we are not in a direct position to verify. Now, the weird fact about living in the world is that although in atheist rhetoric there's a lot of attacks on faith as being unreasonable, the truth of the matter is that no life can be lived, no reasonable life can be lived that isn't to a great degree based on faith. In other words, the skepticism of intellectual inquiry has got at some point to meet the dogmatism of action. Otherwise, no one would ever do anything. Let's say, for example, that I'm planning to propose marriage to a woman. And I say to myself, all right, before I do that, I need to know what life with this woman will be like for the next 25 years. Because after all, I can then decide if I actually want to do it, if I want that life or not. But the truth of the matter is, there is no way to know. I can date the woman for a year, or 2 years, or 5 years. I can say, look, I'm not going to be dogmatic. I'm going to be an agnostic. I'm going to wait for the data to come in. But if I wait for the data to come in, she will marry someone else, so we will both be dead. In short, I can't know. And yet, despite not knowing for sure, I have to decide. And even if I decide no, that is a decision. I'm not evading the decision by not doing anything. I'm still taking the stance of not doing anything. So the point I'm trying to make here is simply this: even though life after death is something that we can't know, it is something that we have to think about because it is a possibility. Now, traditionally, over the past 100 years, famous atheists going back to Bertrand Russell in Why I'm Not a Christian give arguments against life after death. You can't even read those arguments today because they have been completely flattened, not by ingenious theology, but by modern science. One of Russell's key arguments is that we can't have life after death because we know what matter is like. He says we know that our bodies are made of matter, and we know that matter breaks down, it disintegrates, it collapses. And we can see that that actually happens to our bodies. And since we can see what the qualities of matter are, we have to recognize that this concept of life after death, remember, by the way, in the Jewish and Christian tradition, it's not just that there's life after death in which we live as immortal souls. It is that after death, we live on not only as immortal souls, but as reconstituted bodies. Bodies that are different than the ones we have now, but nevertheless, that in Jewish and Christian theology, there's a belief in the resurrection of the body. So Russell's point was, that's crazy, because we know what matter is like. But the truth of it is that today, if you walk into Barnes & Noble, you will find a book called The 4% Solution, the theme of which is that as a consequence of recent discoveries about dark matter and dark energy, we actually only know the properties of the matter and energy that make up 4% of all the matter in the universe. In other words, we are looking at a universe of matter and energy, and we happen to understand a small subset making up 4% of that matter, and all our generalizations about matter are based on that. In short, today, the idea that we know what matter is like, we know what matter can do, has got to face the humility of recognizing that we actually don't. Or take, for example, the Christian concepts of heaven and hell. The basic idea of heaven and hell was always that these are, in a sense, alternative realms. They're not like the earth. They don't operate by the same principles of the world here and now. They're organized differently. And again, this concept seemed crazy in a world in which nature was defined to be truly all there is. Nature is all there is, and so the concept of anything being beyond that was incoherent. But today, again, in the mainstream of science, we have all these discussions about things like alternative universes, multiple universes, an infinity of universes in which every combination of physical laws is at some point realized. A universe in which E is not equal to mc squared, and light does not travel at speed c. And this is the mainstream of scientific discourse. So suddenly, the concept of an alternative realm that operates according to different principles, in which the rules of the earth and the world here and now don't apply, I would say, has been rendered plausible, certainly within the realm of thought and not outside the realm of possibility, by modern science itself. And finally, I want to make one more point and then just throw the floor open to general discussion. Life after death is somehow entangled with the issue, it always has been, of morality. In other words, the Hindu doctrine of reincarnation. You were a terrible guy in this life, okay, we're going to be seeing you as a cockroach in the next life. What's that called? It's basically called cosmic justice. Cosmic justice. And cosmic justice is actually a very important concept. Why? Because we don't have terrestrial justice. Right? We live in a world where, although, when I came to America, one of the first phrases I heard was, what goes around comes around. Well, not always true. Sometimes the bad guy does end up on top. Sometimes the good guy does come to grief. And maybe that's just the way it is. But it seems like in all the major religions of the world, there's a belief that no, there is ultimately some settling of cosmic accounts. There is some karma, one might say, in which one has to pay for one's misdeeds. There are crimes that ultimately go unpunished here, but will be punished later. So this is morality. And what is morality? That very strange being that inhabits us, that is distinct from us, that makes claims upon us. It has absolutely no power to make us do anything, and yet none of us refuses to acknowledge its supreme authority. In other words, the voice of right and wrong is such a mysterious fact of nature. One of the remarkable things I think about the philosopher Kant is that he tells us that morality is as much a fact in the world as any other. And in fact, if there's a human being who doesn't have morality, we have a name for such a human being, sociopath or psychopath. So morality isn't some ethereal thing. It is as real as anything else we experience. And as I say, morality is within us, but nevertheless, it seems to be a nagging force that is constantly thwarting us from doing what we want to do. Morality can never be fully equated with self-interest, because if it were identical with self-interest, we wouldn't need it. It would play no role whatsoever. We don't need morality to determine our self-interest. We're pretty good at figuring that out on our own. Morality is often the voice that says you want to do that, but you shouldn't. You don't want to save that drowning person in the pond because you don't really know how to swim, and what's she to you anyway? She's not your cousin. And even if there are 8 of her and you add up their genes, the point I'm trying to make is that morality militates against what we want to do. So where does that come from? There's an effort to explain morality simply in evolutionary terms. Morality is ultimately simply an effort, a kind of long-term effort to protect your genes, your genetic succession, or it's reciprocity. You scratch my back and I scratch yours. And I would argue that if you look at the big scope of morality, that argument explains about 1/3 of morality. It is true, for example, that somebody who owns a business might say, I'll be nice to my customers not because I'm a nice person, but because I want them to come back and buy from me again. Reciprocal altruism. But there's a whole bunch of morality that just doesn't fit that. I mean, a guy gets up to give his seat to an old woman in a bus. That's not because next week he wants her seat. He's just doing it. He gets nothing out of it. And yet he would feel kind of bad if he didn't do it. Why? So what does this actually have to say about life after death? It says nothing except the fact that there appears to be a certain kind of tribunal that we live under called conscience. And this tribunal is here in this world, but it has absolutely no judicial power in this world. It only has the power to point us in a direction that we sometimes don't want to go. I have really enjoyed, over the years, debating leading atheists. The one guy who's refused to debate me, Richard Dawkins, we have debated on TV. We just have never debated in person. But Hitchens and I debated 10 times on major campuses. It was always a great event. I very much miss him. And I miss his style of debating, which we seemed to be very well matched against each other and had a lot of fun. Very often we'd finish our debates and then sit down. Christopher would produce normally more than 1 bottle of wine, and we would then have conversations that had nothing to do with theology, but mainly focused on the misdoings of the Clintons. And one time Christopher told me about the time that he was beaten up by a group of mullahs. It was supremely entertaining. To me, it's the right way for belief and unbelief to engage in a dialogue. In other words, a dialogue that's not unspirited, but one that's friendly. And at the end of the day, if I can leave you with one thought on this topic, is it seems to me that both the believer and the unbeliever are on a joint quest in trying to figure out the truth of the matter. To me, it's a real pity when we speak multiple languages that don't engage each other. It would be good if we could try harder to find a common language in which this joint quest could somehow be combined, or if not combined, at least conducted in a more civil and hopeful manner. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to take some questions, and I believe we're going to do them on the middle aisle. We have a microphone up here, so if you can keep your question brief, that'd be helpful. I'll do my best to answer quickly and take as many as we possibly can.
Appreciate your comments. I think you left out an important component. Robert Browning wrote a poem entitled Death in the Desert, and he has, I believe it was John the Revelator, saying, "How will it be when no more saith, I saw?" You're leaving out people who are testifying to having seen in your discussion, and the atheist has to reject their testimonies. Being a member of the LDS Church, it doesn't go back more than a couple of generations where we believe that people say, I saw. And I think that's another component of the argument.
I'm sorry to say I didn't hear the question all that clearly, but are you talking about the near-death experiences?
No, I'm not. I'd like you to comment on the fact that there are two components, not just the historical belief in the afterlife, but people who have actually experienced it, not near death, but, and in fact, many people. Paul talks, I think, in Acts about 500 at one time. This is different than just believing in the afterlife because of some other reasons. These are people that say, I saw something, and the atheist has to confront that. I don't think they can just wave that away. Any comments on that?
Sure. Well, I think what you're referring to is the very interesting observation that is made by Paul in defending the fact that Jesus was resurrected, in which instead of saying something like, we believe it based on faith, Paul says there are 500 guys who actually saw it. And he says some of them are dead, but a lot of them are not, and I can produce them. And I think that is actually a rare but interesting case where in the Bible there is an appeal to evidence. Paul is actually appealing to eyewitness testimony that he claims he can produce. Typically, it's not that way. Typically, it's more a case where the Bible makes a claim. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. Kind of a remarkable statement if you think about it, because the first question you ask yourself is, who's speaking? Who's speaking? Not God, because in the beginning, God. It doesn't say in the beginning, I made the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. So there's the assumption that there was another person there who recorded the incident and is commenting on it. But who? No one else was around. But the Bible never tries to resolve these anomalies. It asserts them and it declares them. Let's go on.
Hi, Dinesh. Mark Klugman. Something you touched upon, and I'd like to dig a little bit deeper if you would help with that. Intelligent design, the Discovery Institute, our friend George Gilder here, it's treated dismissively by secular intellectuals as that's faith, that's not science. Whereas their cosmology is regarded as not faith-based. I'd like if you would kick the tires a little bit on what is it that an atheist must believe in terms of cosmology. You've referred to one thesis of the multiverse. There are a few of them, and it strikes me these are pretty exotic ideas. and that you very quickly find yourself waist deep in faith if you want to buy into this stuff. Would you mention what is it that an atheist must believe so we can figure out, is that faith?
So the question is about intelligent design, and the problem is that, to me, is that the intelligent design debate is generally focused in a place where the intelligent design argument is actually the weakest. The intelligent design argument is usually mobilized as a dispute over evolution, whereas essentially every Jew, every Christian believes in some form of intelligent design. The intelligent design argument at its strongest today, by the way, the Anglican divine William Paley made the intelligent design argument in the early 19th century, when he basically said if you're walking on the seashore and your foot hits up against a rock, he says that's not going to tell you a whole lot about anything because you don't know how long that rock could have been there. It could have been there as far as you know forever. But he says if you're walking on the seashore and you happen upon a watch, you pick it up, you take a look at it, and you know that someone made that watch. You don't know who made that watch, and you might not know how that person made the watch, but you do know that the watch didn't just get there. Molecules didn't just assemble themselves to create a ticking watch. Even without knowing the source of the watch, you know that that is intelligently designed. Someone did that with a purpose. That was Paley's argument. And Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, says, Paley has been decisively and gloriously refuted. Not so. In fact, Paley's argument, if now incorporated into the arguments of modern physics and cosmology, is much, much stronger now than when he made it, because Paley had a very rudimentary knowledge about design. Paley made arguments like the fingers are really well designed to pick up things. True. But today, a great deal is known about our universe, and it is known and accepted widely by scientists that if the so-called dials of the universe are changed, for example, if light didn't move at speed c but moved a little slower or moved a little faster, if the strong force or the weak force or the force of gravity, if those dials are altered even a very tiny bit, we have no universe, we have no life. In other words, the universe, not just Homo sapiens, not just the Earth, but the whole universe has to be as old as it is and as big as it is and have the properties that it does in order to have conscious beings that can then appreciate that universe or study that universe or be aware of it. If the universe were not that way, we wouldn't be here to have this conversation. Now, that is not an unimportant fact. It seems to suggest design, that the universe was concocted in a certain way to produce conscious beings who are then aware of it. So, guys like my buddy Shermer or Hitchens are now actually forced into a tough position because they've got to explain how the universe got to be so finely tuned if it was not designed. And it turns out that there is actually only one way for that to happen, and that is for there to be, out there somewhere, millions, if not trillions, of universes. Now, if there were millions, if not trillions, of universes, all with their own properties, then we would simply be the lucky inhabitants of the universe that had that set of properties that enabled life, but there would be a virtual infinity of other universes that had other properties. It's kind of like saying that even extremely unlikely things can happen when you have a large enough population sample. But then you say, well, where's the empirical evidence for those universes? Where's the proof that there is even one universe other than our own? And the answer is there is none. And many scientists believe there never will be. Why not? Because the laws of those universes are different than our laws. So we have no access to those universes. In a sense, they become ships passing in the night. In other words, the atheist position, it seems to be now, also requires a massive extrapolation of faith. In fact, even more stunning than the Christian belief. Because in order to get rid of one invisible God, you have to postulate with no empirical evidence at all, an infinity of invisible universes. And a Christian can be forgiven in saying, I'd like to believe that, but I just don't have that much faith.
In discussions with atheists, I sometimes ask the question, well, what is the God you don't believe in? You know, what is your definition of God that you don't believe in? And of course, they can usually come up with a definition that hardly anyone would find appealing. But the opposite is also the case. That is, a believer can define God in a way that's appealing to almost anybody. And even Carl Sagan, in a discussion I had with him once, said, well, if you define God as the sum total of all the laws of the universe, well, then I believe in God, even though he was a well-known agnostic or atheist. I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
The point is not that God is the sum total of the laws, but the fact that the laws reflect intricate intelligence. Here's what I mean. You know, nature is not self-disclosing. It takes hundreds of years to figure out stuff about nature. The truths about nature, particularly the mathematical truths, are hidden. It takes a Galileo to sort of start peeling them out. It takes an Einstein to start figuring them out. So the best human intelligence is required to decipher the code that is embedded in nature. Now here's the question. How did the code get there? In other words, intelligence is coming out. We're figuring it out. The laws of gravity, the elliptical rotation of the planets, there's a beautiful geometrical pattern here. And the question is, how did it get there? Who wrote the code? So in that sense, it's not just that God is the sum total of the laws, but that when you have laws, it requires some explanation. It's kind of like if I'm walking on the street, I look down an alley and I see a human head rolling around, right? I know that that requires some explanation. I can't just say it just happened to get there. Somebody cut off his own head, or there was a murder. Something happened to produce that head. The head demands explanation. The cosmic code is not self-explanatory. That's the point.
Hi, Dinesh. My name is Jeffrey Frischner. I'm from Temecula, California. I think am I classifying you wrong that you consider yourself a religious conservative? Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I would say it's accurate, but I wouldn't say that one has to be religious to be a conservative or anything like that. It's quite possible to be an atheist and be a conservative. I happen to be a conservative who's religious, yes.
Okay. Well, I was born Jewish. I became a born-again Christian and kind of made my way back, thanks to the libertarian movement, to a form of agnosticism. And one of the things I'm working on is a project to try and remove bias. And I know I've seen you on your debates and on Fox, and obviously there's MSNBC on the left. And I was just wondering, how do we? I haven't seen your Christopher Hitchens debates, but I'm very intrigued. I'd love to. Are they on YouTube?
Oh yeah, probably my debate with Hitchens in New York, I think, is the most widely watched debate between a theist and a Christian. We also did a debate at Notre Dame. Given your Jewish background, we did a very interesting three-way debate. Hitchens, Dennis Prager, and me. And it was actually called Atheist, Christian, Jew. And it was held in a synagogue in Orange County, California. And that's also available online.
Well, I've seen the 90-Second Why with Christopher Hitchens' debates against, I forget the rabbi's name, but he uses ad hominem attack a great deal. And I'd like to see debate change in that we come and have a common ground and we try to resolve our differences. Oftentimes, somebody's trying to prove something and everyone is just beating their own horse. Do you see that happening? Is there any way to reform debate?
Well, I find that in the world in which I travel, I encounter two things: Christian dogmatism and atheist dogmatism, even agnostic dogmatism. And the Christian dogmatism is more understandable. We kind of all know what that means, and it does pose a danger. But the atheist dogmatism in some ways is much worse, because the atheist dogmatism refuses to accept itself as such. It insists that it is nothing more than a mathematical application of reason itself. And this is a little bit why in my apologetics I've drawn on the work of Immanuel Kant, because Kant begins by saying, listen, reason is an extremely valuable, indispensable tool. But before we even start the conversation, let's begin by delineating the ground on which reason can safely travel. In other words, what is it that reason can know? If there are things outside of which reason can know, it does not mean that those things don't exist. I'll just give you a brief example of what Kant means. So Kant says we have 5 senses. We have sight, we have smell, we have hearing, and so on. Now, think of a sense as one particular mode of knowing in the same way that if you take a tape recorder and put it at the ocean, right, it records sound. It's not a camera, so it can't take pictures. So the tape recorder is recording one mode of knowledge, namely sound, but that doesn't mean that there are other modes of knowledge. They are simply inaccessible to the tape recorder, being the kind of instrument that it is. We, being the kind of creatures that we are, have a 5-mode instrument called the senses for perceiving reality. Now, we often dogmatically assume that that's all the reality there is. We're kind of like a 5-mode tape recorder that says that because this is all the knowledge that we can trap with our 5 senses, there can't be anything else beyond that, even though in our little scientific experiments we know that there's all kinds of knowledge that our senses, even in the world, can't capture. We can't hear certain types of sound. We can't see certain kinds of things. Other creatures have other ways of perceiving things like sonar. We know all that. But still we think, nevertheless, it is the case that if our 5 senses can't get it, it's not knowledge. It's not reality. It doesn't exist out there. And Kant simply says, that's stupid. That's dogmatic. That's refusing to recognize your own limitations, which is the starting point of being a really reasonable person. So this is the point, that there is a certain dogmatism of reason that doesn't recognize when reason itself has got to be reason itself reaches a certain kind of outer limit. Okay? I think we may be out of questions and out of time. I think we have one more. I'm sorry. So this will be the last one.
Yes, it was, lunch was great, by the way.
Last question. Yes, we're done.
Yes. If you are a Christian, Jew, Buddhist, doesn't matter. You're a believer. And atheists constantly use the argument, that's faith. I contend that atheism is also a religion because it also requires a belief in faith. If that's true, then what the Supreme Court has been doing with this so-called separation of church and state, which isn't constitutional, would go away because atheists would have the same rights as Christians, Jews, etc. Your thoughts?
I'll be very brief on this because this is a big topic you're raising. I don't think that atheism is a religion because I think of religion as requiring some form of belief in, let's say, the supernatural. And if you don't believe in the supernatural, kind of by definition, you're not a religion. Now, I do agree with you that atheism includes multiple claims that can't be sustained on the basis of reason and actually represent dogmatic assertions about reality. When the atheist says things like, there is no God, well, how do you know? And the atheist doesn't know. At the very best, the atheist can say, I'm unsure, I'm an agnostic. But to actually be an atheist is to make a claim of faith, which is, I, in a sense, know that there is no God. It is going beyond the evidence at the very least. So I don't think it makes it a religion, but it does make it dogmatic. Now, with regard to separation of church and state, you know, to me, this is the anomaly of that business. So if you go in front of the Supreme Court or you go to a Capitol building in, let's say, Austin, Texas, and let's say you see a statue of Voltaire. Now, the question becomes, is it okay to have that statue of Voltaire in the Austin State Capitol? And the answer is, let's debate the merits of Voltaire. Let's see what impact he had on the American system. Let's say if we like Voltaire, we democratically debate if we want to have this statue up here or not. And if we agree we want it, we have it, right? That's how it works. Now let's say somebody else wants a statue of Moses. To me, that should be debated in exactly the same terms. Do we like Moses? Was he a good guy? Did he have a big influence on America? Are the Mosaic commandments and laws embedded in our system? Is this something we want to give judicial acknowledgement to? But no, there's a whole bunch of people who jump up and say, that's religious. We can't have a statue of Moses. Why not? What possible difference can there be between a statue of Moses or Jesus on the one hand, or a statue of Voltaire or Tom Paine or Socrates on the other? Why can't we debate every single one of them on exactly the same terms? So this to me is that common ground that one of the questioners raised earlier. That's the way we should move instead of idiotically asserting that there's some substantive difference between a religious symbol and a non-religious symbol, whereas all we're dealing with here is the influence of history on the present. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. So good to see you.
Thank you.